Okay. So I think, given our limited time, we should get started here. Sound good?
Sounds good to me. Looking forward to it.
Sweet. All right. Well, welcome everybody. This is the second AMA we're doing for the Team Topologies book club. We had one yesterday with Manuel. Today we have Matthew joining us. We've got about 30 minutes here to answer the questions that have come through the AMA Team Topologies channel. We are going to be recording this session, so afterwards I'll send it out to everybody, both through Slack and through email. So we don't take up any more time. If you want to you can quickly introduce yourself, say hi, and then we can get started.
Hi folks, thanks for joining. It's really great to be here. It's good to be part of this. So I'm Matthew Skelton. I'm one of the co-authors of the new Team Topologies book. I've been involved in software for just over 20 years, doing all sorts of things from software development through to kind of what's now called DevOpsy stuff, so kind of build, deployment, automation, that kind of thing, but also leading teams, and more recently looking at the kind of bigger architecture pictures, helping organizations to be more effective in terms of how their teams work together, hence eventually the Team Topologies book.
Sweet. All right. Let's just get started with these questions here.
Yep.
Okay. So first one we've got following yesterday's AMA is from Andrew. Picking up from the last AMA, if we are attempting cross-pollination, how do you address the too many team leads scenario? Max's example of DevOps 1 and DevOps 2, both groups have different systems and or approaches. How do you suggest they both join to work on a common backlog, especially in terms of short sprints? There doesn't appear to be a lot of time to get groups with disparate systems working together.
So this is a good question. I'm just looking back to the question that was posted by Maximilian on Sunday. And so Maximilian is talking about, in order to try and spread awareness, to rotate people through two different teams, for example, after the structures have been built. So that's one thing that we'll just briefly mention. And that's maybe, it relates slightly to what Andrew is saying in his question here, but I think there's a couple of different things. So one, the first thing, kind of rotating people through different teams, if that's their choice, and if the kind of dynamic and the trust within the teams is very high, and having those people rotate does not destroy or reduce the trust, then that could be a really useful way of increasing skills and awareness and things. If rotating people starts to decrease the trust significantly, you've got a problem. So then to Andrew's question from today, if two groups have got different systems and approaches, how do you suggest they both join to work on a common backlog, especially in terms of short sprints? So I guess the first thing I'd say to that is, what are you trying to achieve with a common backlog? Is that something that we actually need, or is that a management convenience? So just be careful of artificially forcing teams to kind of work on the same stuff just to make it more convenient from a kind of management perspective, in terms of kind of managing work or managing people's time and that kind of thing. Because the danger there, of course, is that you might have had two separate systems that needed to be separate, and that's why you had two different teams. If you force them to have a common backlog from a management point of view, then you'll start to see coupling between, the likelihood is you'll start to see coupling between these two different supposedly independent systems, which is not what we need from an architectural point of view. So just be careful of introducing unnecessary coupling like that. If you from an architectural point of view need much more coherence between the systems that these two teams are working on, if effectively you need a single system, then you're going to have a period where those two teams are going to collaborate very closely together. They're going to have to work together. You might even decide to somehow merge them. One of the patterns in the book, actually, one of the case studies we've got in here, talks about, sorry, actually, no, it's not in the book. it's from the same organization as a case study in the book. So Sky Betting and Gaming have a case study in here, and there's a talk which I will find and put in the channel. I'll put a link to the talk. They talk about paired teams, so teams that have a very shared purpose, but they still have kind of separate identities of two different teams, and they can work off the same backlog. And they tend to have different roles, a slightly different focus for the two teams, but they have a lot of trust between each other. So I'll dig out that case study in a bit. I think the key thing is to align the purpose. If the purpose of the two teams is identical, if they were effectively working on the same logical flow of change, then it will be much easier for them to work together. So you really have to think about kind of the business purpose before trying to artificially force two teams together.
Great. Okay, you ready for the next one?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So next question is from Christy. Is there a benefit in mapping out teams' current communications channels across and out of an org chart, as teams or an org chart are seemingly in the middle of traditional org and a lean agile org?
It's a good question. So is there a benefit in mapping teams' current communication channels? Absolutely, yes. I think one of the benefits that will produce, if you map out how teams actually communicate, not just the idealized version with the org chart, if you map out how teams actually communicate, it will bring to the surface some kind of workarounds and some unexpected communication paths that are there either accidentally or in order to, as I said, work around some of the organization's problems. So actually, depending on how much trust and maturity you have in that organization, that may cause a major problem, or it may actually be really useful. If you have a high degree of trust and maturity in the organization, then surfacing the real communication channels will be seen as a good thing. If you've got an organization which is low trust and an organization which tends to look for blame, then uncovering the real communication channels will be seen as a threat. So you have to work out whether, what kind of organization you're actually working in before, if you like, sharing that kind of true communication map more widely, because it could have a very positive result, or it could have a very negative result, depending on the kind of organization you're working in. But it will be very revealing, whichever kind of organization it is. It will reveal a lot, and it will allow you then to look and get a kind of heuristic or a sense of the natural pressure for a certain kind of architecture. So this is based on Conway's law. If you look at the actual communication structures within the organization, you'll get a clue, a hint about the kind of software architecture which is likely to emerge from that kind of communication structure.
Great. Okay. Speaking of Conway's law, next question. What was your aha moment where you realized the significance of Conway's law? From Jarek.
So I think it's a good question. I think I had a series of aha moments with Conway's law. And I was trying to think of the earliest time that I read about Conway's law, and I'm just going to, here we go. I'm going to put a link in the thread about Conway's law, and it was from I read a blog post or article, or maybe I watched a talk by Alan Kelly, who's written an awful lot about Conway's law, and he's been writing about this stuff for many years, and he's done presentations and so on. So let me just put this link in the channel. So I've just put that in there now. It's to a blog post of his from 2006, so that's like 13 years ago now. But it certainly, it was an article like that I read many years ago now, that got me thinking about some of these dynamics. Slightly more recently, kind of one of the origins of the thinking around team topologies came from when I was working in an organization in London. It was e-commerce organization, quite decent revenue, lots of people. So we had, I think, several hundred, like 300 people, something like this. And I felt, the team I was on at the time, I felt like I was right in the middle of a very awkward result of Conway's law, effectively, because of how the organization was structured and how the different teams had different responsibilities. It got me thinking about this kind of stuff. And I did have an aha moment then. And that's when I came up with the original, what we've called DevOps topologies, which are the original kind of Venn diagrams. I'll put a link to that in the channel as well. So DevOps. So these original kind of Venn diagrams have become fairly sort of standard for companies thinking about team structures. At least it's a standard until recently. Hopefully, Team Topologies, the book, will be will surpass that. But certainly, the DevOps topologies diagrams have helped lots of organizations like Netflix and Condé Nast and organizations like this. And those diagrams came out of this aha moment from when I was in this organization, seeing the kind of different dynamics and seeing these sort of boundaries between teams. Let me just put that link in the thread as well. There we go. That's in there now as well.
Cool. And I'm grabbing these and I'll put them somewhere later for everyone to see. Okay. All right, you ready for the next question?
Yep.
Okay, so we've got sort of a two-parter here from Dennis. Where have you seen Conway's law not hold true? And then what other universal truths did you consider for this book but didn't make it to the final print edition?
So I think these questions are really good, and I want to thank Dennis or Denny for those questions. Very nice. I suspect he asked them with a smile on his face. That's certainly how I interpreted them. So Conway's law is an interesting one, right? Because it's not a law of physics. It's, again, going back to Alan Kelly calls it the homomorphic force, which is a kind of tendency for things to be self-similar. And because we're not talking about simple physics here, we're talking about kind of socio-technical systems. It's more of a tendency than a law. So we would, it's the question is nice because it reveals the nature of Conway's law. So we cannot expect to see a one-to-one mapping between the way in which teams communicate and software architecture, because let's say we have an organization with very high discipline, very high engineering ability, very high trust between people. That group of people may well be able to overcome the natural kind of pressure from Conway's law and build something which does not directly mirror the communication path between the team, because they can surpass that, if you like. A bit like if you've got a group of sports people, let's say they're runners, and they run a marathon, and these people run marathons like every weekend or something like that. These people will, their level of fitness is very high. They'll be able to run, do a run around a park or something like this without any trouble at all. Compare those people to people who have never run before. If they try and run a marathon, they're going to be acting against all kind of forces that's going to make it very hard for them. So likewise, organizations that are very high performing may well find that, but by investing additional time and so on, they're able to kind of overcome some aspects of Conway's law. Those organizations that have much less trust and a much less low performing, what we're seeing is generally they do seem to be pushing up against this kind of tendency, this mirroring tendency. So it's a nice question in that we're not expecting a one-to-one mapping. What we're doing is expecting to see organizations struggling to different degrees with this kind of homomorphic force, this mirroring between the team communication and the likely software architecture. So the second part of that question, what other universal truths did you consider for the book, but that didn't make it to the final print edition? So I don't think I consider Conway's law a universal truth exactly. It seems to be a force that's there. It makes kind of sense. There's quite a decent amount of academic research in this area recently, so peer-reviewed scientific articles, and we've referenced several of these in the book. You'll find it in the back in the references section. But because it's not something that's possible to characterize very exactly, there's kind of more work to be done in this area, and it's difficult to find like-for-like comparisons and controls and things. But what I can certainly say is that some people have these ideas about software development that they think are universal truths, like you must use Scrum, or you must have 2-week sprints, or something else, whatever, or you must adopt SRE as an approach for cloud systems, whatever. The key thing that a lot of these people miss is that these might be close to universal truths in specific contexts, but step outside of that context and change the dynamics, and those truths no longer apply. So they're not really universal truths. What they are is specific solutions in a particular context. And obviously, this is quite a common theme. What we've tried to do in the Team Topologies book is look beneath some of the received wisdom over the last, few years, decades, whatever, and try and look underneath that and find some dynamics, find some rules, if you like, find some tendencies that should inform how we make decisions. If I get a chance, I'll have a look back and see if I can find if anything that we explicitly excluded. But we deliberately tried to not kind of talk about any kind of universal truths like this in that kind of way. So hopefully that's a sensible answer to that question. But thank you for both of those.
Okay, so next one we've got here is from Tom. I've worked for numerous small but growing companies over the past few years, and there's always a lot of churn in staff and team structure due to growth and shifting priorities. This obviously conflicts with the notion of long-lived teams as a goal mentioned in the preface. How do you mitigate that?
It's a good question. Thanks, Tom. I think there's two parts to this. There's two parts to this churn in staff and team structure, and there's at least two parts to it. The two parts that I can think of are, one, the organization is not giving people what they need or what they want. And so you get this high churn, this turnover of people who get bored or get frustrated or don't understand what they're doing, and so they want to move team or they want to leave. And a specific thing that we've addressed in the book, let me just find the chapter. It is the team chapter, I think it's chapter 3. Yes, I mean, it's chapter 3, and it's also the chapters later on in the book around the behaviors for the different team types and interactions. So kind of chapter 3 and chapter 7 and chapter 6. One thing we've tried to do in the Team Topologies book is to address the big gap that we've seen when working with lots of different organizations, where people are working in an organization, building software or doing something to do with software testing or in operations or whatever, but they don't really understand why they're working on that thing. They don't really have a sense of a cohesive team. It might just be a kind of a loose collection of people. And they don't really understand, even if they have a cohesive team, they don't really understand how they should be working together with other people in different teams. So that's one thing we've explicitly tried to address in that. And from what we can see, for organizations that have a much clearer team boundaries and much clearer team purpose, seem often to have less of a problem with this kind of churn, with people getting frustrated and leaving and so on. So that's one thing we've tried to kind of characterize quite clearly in the Team Topologies book, specifically to address this, to help people have a much clearer sense of their purpose individually, but also within a team, and crucially how that team is supposed to fit into the kind of organization as a whole. So hopefully that starts to address some of the churn. The second part of the question there is about growth of the organization or growth of the business, shifting priorities. Many organizations have a very ad hoc, a very poor or not well thought out approach to business development. Effectively, they don't know. Many of the people on the business side, people haven't had the right kind of conversations about how business decisions affect the viability of the software that we're building. And that's a problem. So you get these kind of shifting priorities saying, oh, we need to have everyone working on this new feature over here. And now, 3 weeks later, we need everyone working on this other thing over here. And obviously that causes problems in the software architecture. I think that's changing somewhat with the introduction of kind of product thinking, what you might call product thinking, however you call it. It's kind of, some people might call it kind of more service-based thinking. But anyway, the key thing there is you've got a long-lived focus on a particular kind of stream of change that's highly focused on the kind of user experience and meeting user needs and this kind of thing. And that does seem to have seem to make the purpose and mission of people within organizations much clearer, because we've got this ongoing mission around a particular set of priorities, which shifts less. So that can help too, if you kind of adopt this kind of product thinking or service-oriented sort of thinking. Growth is a bit more tricky because you just have to have more people doing stuff. If you're growing extremely rapidly like a startup, you're going to have to accept some messiness in the architecture. That's just how it is. As long as we've got kind of Conway's law in mind, that we're not going to put people in teams that are going to make the architecture very bad. At least with most of these teams, like we say in the book, are going to be kind of stream aligned. We're looking for these kind of business, looking for the right kind of domain boundaries, using techniques like DDD and so on. So at least we're using techniques which are likely to give us some sensible software architecture. But yeah, it's hard.
Great. Okay. Next question. Have you had success with an HR organization helping them understand Conway's law and its implication through org design? This comes from Keith.
That's a nice question. Yeah, thanks, Keith. I have not worked directly with HR departments yet, at least not since we've been working on the Team Topologies book. I've done some stuff kind of prior to that. But two things on that. So several years ago, when I was working in London, one of the things I was involved with was in realigning the various different teams, lots of development teams, realigning the teams so that instead of the teams working on anything across the whole software estate, we aligned them to different slices of the software. I mean, effectively, it was more like components at the time, but over time it evolved into something a bit more like streams. And there was a bit of work that we did with some of the kind of what we call the development managers from an HR point of view. It wasn't exactly what I think the question's talking about there, but in the book there's a really good case study. Let me find it. I'll go to the case studies bit, and this is the case studies around Auto Trader. So this is a case study on page 53. Where people at Auto Trader, which is an organization based in the UK, which helps people to buy and sell vehicles. And they went digital a few years ago. It used to be all print, and they went digital. So they're selling huge volumes or helping people to buy and sell huge volumes of vehicles online. What they realized, because they're very fortunate, they have had a CEO that understood Conway's law, understood the need to think about how people in the organization sit together and communicate. And they arranged their office building, their office space, so that all the people in one kind of business division sit together. So if you think about it, in a traditional organization, let's say you might have sales and marketing on one floor, you might have engineering on the next floor, and you might have like legal, HR, admin, the CEO or C-level people on another floor, kind of split by function like that. That's quite common. However, what Auto Trader realized is that they should seat people by business area. So I think they had like private car sales, maybe commercial car sales, something else. Everyone in that business area was sitting together or sits together. So engineering people, ops people, HR people, legal, finance, they all sit in that same stream. Mm. And so that goes even beyond kind of HR organization. That was the entire organization was arranged in the office with Conway's law in mind. So it's worth having a look at that case study on page 53.
Great. Okay. Next one we got is from Andrew here. Saying this might be covered later in the book, but his organization has a dedicated and centralized 24/7 enterprise command center that deals with all first-line monitoring and support across service application infrastructure and second-line support for infrastructure. This is separate to our end user-facing IT service desk. Do you have a view on how these could or should be considered when it comes to potentially bringing together of IT change, dev, and IT ops teams?
It's a good question. Thank you, Andrew. And it's a very common situation. So you're definitely not the only people in that situation. It is covered later in the book. Let me share with you a link that I dug out before. We actually talk about this in the book, but I'll share the link with you so you can read an article. So I'll just get into this thread 1 second and share the link. And there we go. So the article by John Hall, and he talks about swarming and replacing kind of different tiered support with a more dynamic model. I think it's a very interesting model, and I've seen some similar things work in some places, and there's organizations now starting to talk about this kind of model. There's two things I wanted to say about this in response to this question. The first is that what we talk about in the book is we've got these 4 fundamental types of teams: a stream-aligned team, enabling team, complicated subsystem, and platform. Now, in your model there, you've got some first-line monitoring, second-line support for infrastructure. So in the Team Topologies model, you would have some people responsible for the underlying platform, but those people are not responsible for the runtime applications that sit on top. The people responsible for the applications, the success of the application on top, are the people in the streamlined teams. There are some variations like kind of the Google SRE model, but still arguably that's a kind of stream-aligned thing. It's separate from the underlying platform. And so that's one of the biggest changes that we're seeing out of the last few years is the need to separate platform from applications that are running on top, and make sure that we've got different groups of people responsible for supporting those two different kind of constructs, if you like, applications on top of a platform. So that's the first thing to think about. What was the second thing that I was going to say? Yeah, well, so there's a nice diagram in the book, which is on page 107. I'm just going to put it onto the screen. 1 second. Here we are. So it looks, where is it? Looks like that on page 107. And the key thing here in the kind of team topology approach is to ask ourselves this question: does the kind of service desk or first line or second line, to what extent does that help to produce high quality sensory input into the stream-aligned teams? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to give the stream-aligned teams who build the systems the best kind of input about how their software is working in production. Now, if we have a huge number of telephone calls coming in from end users, or a huge number of alerts and things, that is not high quality sensory input. That's noise at that point. So then that's why you might have a team kind of fielding some of that kind of information, or those kind of inbound requests. But if you have 3-tier or even 4-tier support or something, and if the information about what's running in production is not getting through to the stream-aligned teams, then you have a problem, because those teams are the ones that need to be able to respond quickly to what's happening in production. So whatever kind of team structure, whatever kind of teams you have looking at production and sitting between production and the stream-aligned teams, the purpose should be to provide high quality, relevant, recent sensory input into the stream-aligned teams. That should be the test for the kind of like first line, second line support, whatever that you have in place. The aim is always rapid, good quality input into the streamlined team, so they can make decisions quickly and be aware of how their software is working and then correct it quickly.
That's great. Okay, we have a couple more questions here. I know we're at time. If you have a couple more minutes,
yeah, we can take a couple more questions. Yeah, okay. That's good.
So next one's from Mike. How do you capture the impact on Conway's law and how it has shaped the existing architecture and teaming structure that we are trying to change? What approaches do you recommend for visualizing this to make it tangible for people who are nose down in building and operating, or the high level leadership?
I think actually I'd like to answer this question and the next question together. So the question's from Johan as well, who's talking about, can you name some applications that can be used to visualize teams in network structure, dynamic apps that are connected to a user directory like Active Directory? And Johan's also saying, isn't the hierarchical org chart still unfortunately the most used form of how the organization works? So I think these effectively are sort of talking about the same thing. So I'd like to answer them together. There are 1 or 2 tools in this space that are starting to come out. I think it's a super interesting space. I think there's real opportunity for some enterprising people to build something that's quite compelling. For example, imagine if you could look at the way, so let's say your organization uses a tool like Slack, or maybe Microsoft Teams or something like that, or HipChat from Atlassian, whatever. And imagine if you could get a tool which could look at the patterns of communication between different people in one of these kind of tools, somehow map that communication into different teams, and work out what kind of communication is happening. We're not looking at the content of the message particularly. We might be looking just at the volume of traffic. Not to minimize the kind of privacy implications, but it could be super interesting to see, well, actually this team over here spends a lot of time talking to this team over here, but as far as we're aware, these are in very different parts of the organization and they should not really need to talk to each other. So what's going on there? That should be then a signal that something about how the organization is set up is not quite as we expect. So I think it's really there could be some really interesting applications and software in this space. There's one here that I want to call out, which is Code Scene. So let me just get you a link to this. So I'll just put it straight in the AMA chat because I'm answering 2 questions. So Code Scene, I think we mentioned this in the book as well. Code Scene is a code analysis tool, but one of the really nice things, it's super fancy. I think it's amazing. I think Adam Thornhill, who's the main person behind Code Scene, has done some amazing work in this space. But one of the really nice things about Code Scene is it has some social network analysis. So let me just share. What I'm going to do is I'm just take a quick screenshot, and I'll pop the screenshot in the Slack channel in a second. But it does some social analysis of how people have committed code. So you can see who kind of works with whom, who tends to change code that's related to somebody else's code, this kind of thing. And they have also a feature which allows you to map individuals onto teams, and therefore have a look at how excuse me, how teams are communicating and the responsibility of teams working on code inside an organization. So we're now starting to see some tooling in this space. In this particular case, it's looking directly at the commits from version control. In this case, Git, because Git has got a very rich kind of version history. It allows us to do all sorts of analysis and so on it. But we're starting to see some things in this space come out, which I think is really interesting. We'll probably see some innovation in this area over the coming years. So let me just put this in the Slack channel, and there we go. And I'll put a link to the exact URL that I took that image from, and it goes in there. There's also, I'll send a link to some documentation as well. What can we do? We can copy image. We can do this as well. So that image comes from this location. So this is a documentation from Code Scene that shows a visualization of teams and individuals within teams and how they're collaborating and communicating. I think it's super interesting in this space. So 2 great questions. I wish there were better tools. I wish I had the time to write a tool which is like this and which helped us to look at the architecture and things like this. As if anyone's got any additional tooling that they want to suggest, please do that. I think it'd be super interesting to talk about that stuff, because it's going to get, it's already valuable, and it'll become more and more valuable for us to look at this kind of stuff.
Cool. Those are fun to look at.
I think those are the only links I had to share. Let me just have a check and look back at some of the other questions. I think that's it. Yeah. So, has anyone got any more questions? Anything come up since since we've been having the discussion? I've probably got time for like one more quick question. If anyone wants to ask anything.
Yeah, feel free to post it in the AMA Team Topologies channel.
Otherwise, I hope to be online in the next couple of days. I'll just drop into the other channels and answer a few questions in there because there's been some great discussions going on.
Cool. Looks like it might be it for now.
That's great. All right. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all the questions. It's been really good to kind of dive through those and think through some of the answers. Really appreciate it. Oh, we've got a possible question coming from Steve.
No.
Aha, it's just a thank you. All right. Thank you, Steve. Thanks, everyone else. Really appreciate it.
Cool. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. Thanks for taking the time today and the extra time, Matthew. That was awesome.
That's all right. It's great. Good, Alex. Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.